10:30 p.m. United States East Coast here in Maine. Say hi to everyone who's here. Say hi to Dana. Dana, say hi.
Mm.
So Dana's here, although she might pass out. We'll see what happens. It's kind of late for her, and usually it's later than the shows I do. But I didn't have a chance to come on this morning. A lot of things were happening, and I was watching pretty closely what was happening with Russia and the market. So we'll talk about all that today, and we'll go into whatever you want to talk about it. It being an evening show, we're going to be more free form today, and I don't want to block the camera. I just want to see how many people are here, and I have to adjust the lighting just ever so slightly. So welcome to you all. Lord's blessing be
Mm.
upon you. I want to thank everyone who has been checking out the new book, the single biggest hit in the history of Amazon in whatever obscure category I put it in. Surviving the Fall of America, my newest book, which has been long promised, and frankly, it's never been more timely when you look at what's been happening out there. So check that out, as well as the other books available on Amazon, Kindle, Audible, and whatever other sources. So I'm always used to see my books on like eBay, thrift books. It's kind of funny how that all works out. Also want to thank everyone who supports the program by being supported by Venmo, CVC, PRV, and the little messages and little things you guys send me. Good to see you, Ryan. The good little messages you send me at PO Box 343, Eagle Lake, Maine 04739 are absolutely tremendous. And some of the little things and the kind comments from myself and my wife, I really appreciate those, and she does as well as for those of you who send messages on the email newalbion@protonmail.com. And I want to thank everyone for your ongoing prayers, your support of the program, support of the ministry work I do as well. If you haven't checked out what I do at Sons of Dust, give it a shot. Hell is a bad place. You don't want to go there. Maybe a word there will keep you away from that. I know a lot of you are already on the right path, and those of you who haven't checked it out yet, today could be your day of salvation. So definitely take a look at that. All right, so we're going to go into the show this evening, and rather than having a specific theme, I just want to talk about things I'm looking at. I want to encourage some participation tonight. I purposely picked a later evening live show so we can talk about some different things, and we can certainly go into like the weird and esoteric a little later. That's always fun. So let's start by talking about Russia, what's been happening, and talk about Europe more broadly. So today was Victory Day over there in Russia, the celebration of the defeat of the Third Reich by the Allies in Europe. And let's see, one thing that drew a lot of attention was the Russian ambassador in Warsaw, if I remember right, got a bucket of red paint thrown at him. I'm sure the Russians love that. But those sort of things do happen in European politics, and it's a little bit more visceral. Here in America, everyone has their own security details, so you get shot for getting near anyone. But in Europe, they seem to allow people to rough it up a little bit. Maybe it goes back to the whole French Revolution thing. In any case, Putin went out there and he gave a speech where he didn't announce any large developments other than to say that while NATO was not going to be permitted to use Ukraine as a launching point against Russia. And if he actually means that, and we take the telegraphing seriously, considering how much money he's been investing, what you have to assume is Russia's strategic goal will have to eventually include the occupation of Kiev. And if you're going to occupy Kiev to remove the government, you're going to have to go far enough to keep it permanently. And that means maybe they choose to let Western Ukraine go to Poland, Hungary, and Romania, and the well understood partition, but that you will continue to see the push continue forward toward Odessa. So as business is finishing up in Mariupol, we've seen the Russian troops push more into Kharkiv, and at the same time, we've seen the Allied side, if you want to think of it that way, continue to look for new support. We are hearing that by the end of this week, that Sweden and Finland will be seeking, or at least Finland will be seeking accession to NATO to begin that process formally, and that the conversations that have been happening between Helsinki, Stockholm, and Washington, as well as London, are to guarantee for the safety of those countries under the NATO umbrella while they're under the accession process. And that process is what I want to talk about a little bit tonight. In Europe, the re-election of Emmanuel Macron, who went ahead and put on all sorts of weird, crappy surveillance measures 5 seconds after, the election was declared for him over Le Pen, they are trying to reform the European Union. And it's kind of an 1861 moment for Europe in this sense. The European project for a long time was conceived, it came out, actually, the history of the EU, let's talk about this for a second. The history of the EU is that there were six countries: France, West Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and I believe, I want to say, and then France, of course. And they had it was called the EC. It was actually the European Economic Community. It was a mining compact actually for minerals going from the Ruhr. If you know the history of earlier wars and how they fought over who controlled that between France and Germany, they didn't want to have this happen again in the post-war era. And Adenauer went out of his way to make sure that America was in, and that France and Germany would get along, and they wouldn't have the problems they had after World War I, or the Franco-Prussian War, or the Napoleon. France and Germany had a lot of problems. They didn't want to have them anymore. So this is where the European Union came out of. And so what ends up happening is eventually it evolves into the super state with a common currency. They could put the euro in. I think it was like in '99 or so, about that time, and all these countries come aboard. But it was sold to people as a treaty and a compact where every country would have a veto. It would be like if, to use an example in the American context, it would be like if Washington passed a law, then Texas could choose to negate it. And in fact, that was the intention of the 10th Amendment. And it was actually that right by how the states originally claimed that they had the right to secession, and that the Supreme Court ruled after the Civil War, well, that right had lapsed. And in practical terms, it lapsed because of the fact the war was fought over it. Whether or not that right is actually lapsed, I guess secession is a right you always have. It's just what it costs you have to pay to have it. Nonetheless, for the Europeans, the German-French core of the project has wanted to get to a point where Europe would now be a federal state, and where instead of having the ability of a recalcitrant member over different issues, right now Croatia, Hungary, Slovakia, Ireland, different issues, different members can say if one member says no, then none of the treaties can move forward. They want to switch to something more akin to a parliamentary system, where you would have, instead of the members of the European Parliament now who have national vetoes, you would now have a system where, and the details of this haven't been argued out. They're just starting well, I'm sure they've worked it all out in some back room in Switzerland. But what the theory is of the project is that they would now have a single European superstate. And so of the 27 members in Europe, 13 of them are opposed to it. But of course, chicken, do not eat the flippy. Anyway, we have a rowdy hen tonight. I think it's because there's one light on in here, and it's on my face, so she's looking at it. I hope she doesn't peck my toes, but we'll see.
She was trying to cuddle with
Okay, do you want to cuddle with the chicken?
I was cuddling with
All right, why don't you cuddle with the chicken? We're going to say hi. This is Annie. She's being a little feisty. Say Annie. She's here because she's got a little bit of a bothered foot. She was Barb's sister. So if you remember Barb, this is Annie. She's much like Barb. She's a good Rhode Island Red. A good hardy chicken who lays eggs like crazy. Not a very loud layer, too. Some of them are like... "Bop, bop, 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 bop."
She's super quiet.
And some of them, I guess, get an epidural. But, I mean, that's how that goes.
She's a good girl.
All right, so the chicken is here with us,
Boys like her a little too much, so that's why
Yeah, they did. If you ever want to see something terrifying, watch chickens mate, man. They peck each other's head. They just hold them down, and they just go to town.
It's violent.
It is very violent. It's traumatizing. I wouldn't recommend it unless well, I just wouldn't. Let's leave it at that. So anyway, so Europe. So 13 of the 27 countries oppose this, but there is a real push to federalize Europe, and you see that the borders of the European Union are increasingly becoming contiguous with the borders of NATO. You're seeing that the separation from the Russian economy is being pushed at every level, and even though it's operating at different speeds, Macron's went out there and said that we should create something we call the European Political Community, which I don't know what the heck that is, but that Ukraine should come in first, so we offer our commitment as Europe to keep the Russians out and to make Europe an actual federal thing. And so in a lot of ways, it's a bit back to the Cold War mentality, right? That the reason why the US had the security state is because of the Russians, and the reason why the Soviet Union had the security state
She wants to sit with you so bad.
was because of the Americans, okay? Well, now she's going to go on the floor. Aww. So, no, I'm doing a show, and she messed up my light. It took a long time to get that light right. All right, so where were we? We were talking about the European political community. So what they were basically trying to do is create a single Europe. And admittedly, this is a thing where a lot of the states don't want to be on board with it. And most of the states that are going to be hardcore about this are going to be states at the periphery. And so they might try to do the old two-speed Europe. And what I will tell you is if you have the economies of France, Germany, and Italy moving one direction, and that they create a sort of European superstate, it will not be long before the other countries are dragged along. I mean, whatever sort of political finagling has. And for those of you who remember, you might remember something called the Dublin Treaty, maybe about 15, 20 years ago, where Europe there were a lot of countries who didn't want to go in on what was being... Okay, so I am back. I apologize that these things are there. I can't believe Germany's trying to ban Russian gas and oil. They're insane. That would be less insane if they weren't shutting down the nuclear reactors there and in France and everywhere they are. I mean, this is forced austerity, but remember, elites understand that when people are hungry and they're cold and they're angry, they will be violent and they will contemplate revolution. And if they're told the only way they can get out of this is by agreeing to some new system, and I guarantee you they have something set up on the other side of it, they're willing to make this side suffer. And I will tell you, it is my growing suspicion that the Russians are no different in this. And we could get into a lot of details why I think that's the case. You know, a lot of people think Russia's going to be in the catbird seat because they're going to have resources they want to sell. But who are they going to sell it to if the money of the finance system isn't working? They're going to sell it to China. Okay, China has an export-based economy, so who's going to be able to buy Chinese goods if you don't see the Europeans and Americans buying them? The interdependencies between the system. I understand it's very easy to say in this situation that you have the what should I say, that the finance, which is the sort of magic production of the whole thing, is in the West. And you would think that's the least valuable asset of it. But history has shown time and again that this doesn't work out always that way. I'll give you two historical examples. Number one was the fight between Venice and Florence, where and this actually fits the Russian example very specifically because a lot of people think, some very smart people, and I would have thought this until relatively recently, but a deep historical dive has convinced me otherwise, that having a stack of gold will be the salvation of the Russian ruble. But the thing about the Russian ruble is, let's say you make it worth money in gold, okay, which is fine, perfectly reasonable thing. And that's what Florence did to try to take out the Venetian banking contracts, thinking people would come for the specie. And all of a sudden, the Venetians dumped a whole bunch of gold they had been hoarding on the markets. And remember, who was involved in West Africa? The French. Who was involved in South Africa? The English. How much of the money went to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York or the Bank of England in London? So the idea, and remember with the Russians as well, when they let their assets be seized in Switzerland and all these other places, who knows how much gold the Swiss have, or how much gold, another one no one talks about is the Bank of Japan. You know, Japan got a ton of was it the Seagraves book talks about the Yamato dynasty. The Japanese got a ton of gold, which they basically bribed MacArthur with. Which some of it went to the Americans, some of it went to MacArthur, some of it stayed with Hirohito, and they had all this gold in the system that basically left the system into private families and private banking. Okay, your black oligarchy, black nobility. That's the phrase that they use. So all this gold's floating out there. So Russia's thinking we're going to have a gold-based ruble, and everyone thinks gold is worth a lot because we assume gold is very scarce. But what if gold isn't that scarce? Venice knew gold wasn't that scarce, and when they thought that when the Florentines thought they were going to make a bunch of money because they denominated things in gold, what they ended up doing was they dumped all the gold on the market. Gold became cheap, and it destroyed it. The same trick was played by Amsterdam and London to take down the Spanish Empire in the 17th century with a little bit of piracy on top. Looking at you, Francis Drake. Or if you want another example, it's outside. We can even take outside that the trip of Mansa Musa, the Malian warlord king who was famous there, who went to Cairo on a Hajj to Mecca. And what ended up happening was he brought all this gold because Ghana had a ton of it at the time, and they dumped it in the economy there. And what ended up happening was that they destroyed the economy for a decade just through act of generosity. So remember when we're looking at commodities markets that there is a scarcity issue that becomes an issue. And I don't think the people who are doing this global reset, you guys know my ongoing theory. They were basically dealing with the same sort of Phoenician families going all the way back to Babylon who have been using the same sort of scam. If you think you're going to have more gold or silver than they have when they've been running the hustle for 200 years. Look, I'm not saying Vlad isn't a clever guy. He is in a lot of ways. But I think that people who are counting on that to see the collapse of the Western economies, I don't think that's going to be that was a lovely comment, by the way. I don't think that's going to be the thing that's going to break the West. Now, the West is breaking their own currency. They're breaking their cryptocurrencies, which seem to be linked much more into the dollar than anyone thought. I saw the total market cap now is under $1.5 trillion, which is much lower than been. I think it was up over, what, $4 or $5 trillion earlier, 6 months ago. And we have seen BTC go down like crazy. It's going down. I don't know if it broke it, but it was flirting with the 30,000 barrier. So we're seeing all alternative means of financial wherewithal being wrecked. Now, what has actual value? Yes, you can have actual goods and supplies on you. What is it? Beans, bullets, what's the old joke about it? There was like four things with it you want to have. Well, basically, it comes down to food, to luxuries that people are going to want to trade, stuff like that. That's what you're going to want to have on hand. And I'm not saying that having commodity, a little cheap silver isn't good to have. I actually think silver is the smarter bet.
I like
I
cheap
agree.
silver.
I agree with that. Yeah, no, you got to have a little bit of that. Like Ryan says, like Dipper says, absolutely. These are things we could look at. But I want you to be aware of this, that as one group goes down, the interdependencies between the U.S., between Russia, between Europe, China, beans, bacon, whiskey, and lard. Well, those sound like good things to have on hand. Lard's actually a smart call. It's good fat to keep around. Um, but those are things we can keep an eye on. So what I'm saying to you is this: it seems to me that the goal, globally speaking, is to integrate people into these different union states. You know, like the union state that they have brought Belarus into, and Russia's sniffing around countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, bringing different things. Ukraine will eventually get absorbed into that. So we'll see how that all plays out. But what I think you're going to see is that going forward. Now let's talk about China for a second in relation to this. A lot of people assume China's in really good shape. I was watching Dave Hodges earlier, just because, and I was watching about how the lockdowns in Shanghai have gotten to the point where they're asking people to work in the factories and sleep in the factories, that they're having riots there in the city, that people are refusing to work. And apparently, and look, who knows what you can trust on the ground over there, but China's got a whole lot of problems. And if you look at the Chinese yuan on the currency markets, you'll see it's not doing very well. In fact, it's losing currency, it's losing velocity against the dollar, as is the euro, as is the yen. Only the ruble is doing better because on the basis of thought that it's a commodity economy. And they're trying to prop this up. They're planning on having their BRICS conference, and they've invited Argentina there, which is an interesting choice and sort of an obvious one in this one sense. Argentina is an agricultural powerhouse and severely underdeveloped in a lot of ways. So we have these different countries of the global south saying, hey, we're resource powers and we're going to do things. But ultimately, their economies have been set up on an exporting basis where they don't have the internal domestic markets to sell what they need. Maybe the Chinese do. That's arguable. The Indians have the people, but not the money, and the same problem exists in Brazil. So these are problems where, yeah, in the longer term, if this was going to play out over 10 years, you might like their odds, but the high level production just isn't there. And China's worried about its exposure to the various capital markets if they get any deeper into the Russian trap. So we'll see how this all plays out, because a lot of people think that China isn't benefiting from what Russia's doing, rather they found themselves stuck. So, as Dipper writes, this is useful. He has the details. China is about to fall off an economic cliff as their real estate market is about to burst. Over 65 trillion in that bubble. I mean, look, and China's guarantee was that they enter their socialist system so they were going to have guaranteed employment. So they basically build cities whether they have people or not. And as you say, there's a food problem there. There's also a drought problem. You know, I know that they're having issues in China, just like they're having throughout the Western U.S. and in other areas with crop, development. How much has Putin put into Ukraine? I know in terms of the amount of force that Russia's put about 10, maybe 15% of their active duty forces into this. So I don't know the actual money amounts. Both sides are kind of feeling each other out. I do expect we'll see Russia push a little harder. Remember, Ukraine had a problem this year. It didn't get cold enough, and I know it's weird to say that, but the ground was muddy. Russia's always been an armor-heavy division for mobility, and they haven't been able to do that. And to their credit, or detriment, however you want to look at it, the Ukrainians have actually fought a pretty smart war in the sense that they forced the Russians into urban combat, which negates many of the advantages the Russians would like to use. And Russia, since they want to occupy and inhabit Ukraine, and the biggest hint of this is how they're looking at Kherson, what you see, like they're changing all the signs to Cyrillic. They literally gave them a brand new coat of arms. They're giving the people Russian passports and paying the pensioners in rubles. I mean, you don't start paying the old people their salaries and pensions unless you plan on staying in town. So it seems like at a minimum, the land bridge is what they're going to be. What are you peeking? She's peeking wood chips that came off the bottom of the door. Ugh. Anyway.
What?
Give me 1 second. I have to get the bird. You know what? Chickens are almost harder than babies. Chicken. All right. Come here, Buck Buck. You're going to go in here for a little bit. Chickens love styrofoam. They think it's real popcorn. I'm not even making that up. And that's why we don't.
Was it the stuff that blew down from the attic?
Yeah. No, it's from the inside of it's the board inside the door. Anyway, I know. They're nuts. Okay, no, Putin has not sent his best military equipment or his best soldiers, and the fight will be for Odessa. You think Spooked Vids writes, I think Russia's best tanks are scrap compared to NATO tanks. Maybe, I don't know. We haven't seen a head-to-head comparison. It's not just who has the best tanks, who has the best leadership, who has the best command. I don't think, well, I don't know. I don't think NATO doesn't want the war directly with Russia yet. They want to bleed them in Ukraine. If NATO is going to want a war, from everything I've read, and I've read a lot, um, their mobilization will be complete in July, which gives Russia a 2 month window to finish the war in Ukraine. And I suspect the Russians know that. And if they have any claims on Moldova, and any of the other things, I agree with you. Logistics and supply are the most important thing about it. And this is one of the problems for Western Europe, that specifically they're going to be short on supplies, the diesel. I mean, unless they were putting a lot more away in strategic reserves. And look, is it possible there are things off paper we don't know about? Sure, that's always a possibility. Could there be the seizure of different supplies? Maybe. But I mean, Russia's advantage in supplies and oil production, I mean, the thing no one ever thinks about is it's not really hard to break pipelines. I mean, especially if the West and East really got into a war with each other and decided to all those resources, like if China and India are keeping Russia afloat, let's say by buying their oil, it won't be long before those pipelines are destroyed. And it doesn't even have to happen in Russia. You could do it in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan or an intermediate Pakistan, wherever the lines go through. So, I mean, that's the problem with land-based logistics, right? That's why a lot of it has been at sea, and that's why it's been America and in Britain's before that's advantages, that they were moving supplies by sea where they weren't exposed the same way because they had enough naval force projection where all they had to worry about was piracy. And then, and convoy warfare, do you think there's enough of a blue water fleet, or would the submarines be effective enough like the U-boats were for the Germans in taking out allied logistical shipping? And I mean, the logistics of what a World War III would look like that's non-nuclear, that's fought by conventional terms, are an astounding thing to continue. It really goes back to the old battle of sea power, which is the West, versus land power, which is Asia. And the sea power is going to try to fight a mostly defensive strategy and bankrupt the land power, where the land power is going to try to win by decisive force. And over time, history has usually shown that sea power has the logistic advantage, but it usually has a morale disadvantage. So it's tough to see that you have more domestic unrest happening in the West than you will in the East. And that's the major disadvantage you would see from a historical perspective. I'm not putting air power into that because that makes it way too complicated. Although the suggestion seems to be quite strongly that the Russians do have an advantage in air power, in terms of these hypersonic missiles, in terms of, better air defense and weapons. And also the fighter capacity, although the number of weapons, the Germans had the Messerschmitt 262, but it didn't do good because they didn't have enough of them out there because they couldn't decide what they wanted to produce. And then, of course, there's space warfare and drone warfare. Like, one of the things that I've kind of studied in warfare a lot is you see that you're better off to do many cheap and fast. Like, for instance, a drone swarm that could explode that. A drone wall, let's imagine. How much would that actually cost? Let's say you can't build a shield to keep that out. Is that a possibility? And these technologies, of course, this is highly speculative because I don't know what systems NATO has, but I've read enough DARPA reports that I'm not taking anything for granted. They've had a long time to keep a lot of secrets from us. And, this is a push towards a global government. We can see that. We can see that in the passport structures. We can see that in the World Health Organization Pandemic Treaty coming around. We can see that in the fact that the global economy is being deliberately tanked at the same time that food supplies are being reduced worldwide. So, in the end, we are going to lose. All of us are going to lose, and this is going to be the problem of it. So you do need to be preparing for it. But I do think that the intermediate goal is to bring people into these bigger factions and to see Europe brought together. Good morning, EM, or good evening, EM. Let's see. Russia has built up submarines that have the ability to cut underwater pipes and cables. Yeah, I know they were working on that off the coast of Ireland, actually. So I saw that. Let's see. NATO will use Ukraine to tire Russia out. That's the plan. Leopard 2, Challenger 2, and the M1A1 Abrams would mop up all Russia's tanks, I reckon. I don't know. Russia has historically been pretty effective in the field. Their domestic industry works pretty well. And the problem is not just which tanks are better, but it goes to the question of how effectively you see the weapons, the anti-tank weapons perform. The Javelin have not had an incredible field rating from what I've seen. Now, part of that could be training, but there's a lot of people who believe a lot of the Western weapons systems were built more to the specifications of contractors contractors and congressmen than they were to actually field rating usage. I do think that that will quickly solve itself if there is an extended and protracted war, and certainly there will be plenty of contractors to get in on some of that pork. And governments will probably like that because even in the West, they will try to, if they can have military contractor jobs and throw, it's just like the American government. They want to throw another $40 billion to Ukraine when most people in this country are having a harder time filling up a tank of gas in a cart at the grocery store. So they just don't care. And, realistically, if we were smarter, we'd all be saying that, the threats we're facing, the threat from Moscow is a threat for the Russians. The threat from Washington is a threat to the Americans, or London to the Britons, those sort of things. So we have to look at how those things are going to play out. And here's the thing that bothers me, and this was the question I was asking in the chat the other night, was where is the bottom in this market fall? And they're not saying it's going to come anytime soon. And what's the Fed going to do? At some point, if they say they're going to keep raising the rates, they've been projecting another 75 basis point rate the next meeting of the Fed. I mean, the real estate market's in trouble, the housing market's in trouble, construction's grinding to a halt, logistics is getting ridiculous. Diesel's at $6, plus a gallon I've seen. And I'll tell you what, if gas crosses $5 a gallon, people are going to be really hurting. And for people who don't live in the United States, you'll say, oh, why don't you use trains? America's not set up to use trains. America's not set up to use these alternate means of things. And we have the ability to increase production. There you go. Dana's reporting. Truckers, and I saw one of those stories. Yeah, truckers are running out of gas. And you're going to see food rats. They're stranded, yeah. It's terrible. It's disgusting, and this is deliberate. And at the same time, what are they talking about the big problems? And so now we've been given abortion red meat to fight over. And look, abortion is murder. That's how I look at it. However you see it, whatever. But I mean, the timing is always the question, right? The timing. Why do things come up when they come up? And they come up because we are supposed to be fighting each other instead of fighting against the system. And this is one of the big things that I've been trying to talk about. If I can kind of transition a little bit into something a little bit more broad based that I was thinking philosophically, is that it's the things that we put the most emphasis on that get us into the most trouble. So, in our societies, our focus on, financial wherewithal, or focus on a perfect ideological system, all they do is get us into conflict and an inability to solve things. They're not really rooted in developing oneself. They're not rooted in virtue. That we are constantly trying to reshape the world to benefit us instead of reshaping ourselves to have a world that's sane. And the Pinelander ethic, if nothing else, is a means-based revolution where we're trying to reshape ourselves to better people, excluding ourselves as we must from the world to survive, what's going to be a very hard time, because we may quibble over the details of how this is going to fall off, whether you think it's going to be economic collapse first, whether it's going to be a relaunch of a pandemic, natural or evolutionary. There's a lot of people talking about the J&J apparently led to a problem where a bunch of people were having hep that, children actually, because of the way one of the markers was being inhibited. And it's not something we talk about as much on this channel as I should, because algorithmic reasons. But I mean, there's a lot of more evidence going out there. It blew up huge in the UK, and that's where. And you remember, the J&J wasn't as big here; it was much bigger over there, and they are suffering very badly. I have friends over there who are reporting to me that this is really happening. And of course, you could say it was the choice of the people who went forward with these things, and that's true enough. Except for the kids, I feel so terrible for the kids because they got dragged along. But what ends up happening is that basically, I suspect, in the broadest sense, what the world has done is we have weakened our world immune capacity. And so what that's going to mean is, much like an AIDS patient who gets sick from other things and dies from it, that we have created a bunch of petri dishes in the people who are immunocompromised, in a way that is more fundamental than someone who's just going to get sick for themselves, but who is systemically, structurally compromised. And we're talking several billion people here, whatever you believe the actual numbers are. And as these people have these other diseases that don't go away, like monkeypox, or these different manifestations of bird flu, it is a reasonable.
What about me? Lyme.
No, well, sure, Lyme. Well, but the difference here.
Like count?
No, well, of course Lyme counts, but it's more.
No, seriously. Does that fit what you're talking about?
Maybe I don't. What I'm speculating, to put the hypothesis out there, is that people whose immune systems are structurally damaged by medical interventions they took on yourself, and this is where it doesn't apply to you because you didn't choose that, are now making themselves into a position where diseases that should have been dealt with by the immune system will instead have the opportunity to fester in their bodies, become optimized to survive in humanity and may make the leap from people who have been jabbed, who will then be carriers who will get other people sick with more virulent or damaging versions of the sicknesses that would have been destroyed under normal immune circumstance.
You know what someone should do?
Wow.
Dead serious. Someone should make a no-sode for COVID.
Do you want to explain what a no-sode is to people? Because they're not going to understand that.
Oh, dude.
No-sodes are basically where
It's
you take.
homeopathic immunotherapy where you take in a small amount orally, usually, or um,
They can't see your hand.
no, or you can through the skin or the belly button, and it helps your body develop a natural response. It's I use that for,
It's like the original V response was supposed to be, except much milder and gentler for
but it's
and less
actually but
invasive because it's dead.
it's diluted down to such a minuscule amount, but enough to trigger a reaction,
Evening, Zoid.
just like other homeopathics do. But there's no certs for everything out there. Lyme, Bartonella, all that
You
stuff.
name it, it's out there.
Someone
But
should make one for COVID.
inoculation, yeah. But the difference with inoculation was they would put either live or dead directly into the blood serum. This is usually topical or oral. There are other ways too, but I don't want to get into that. I mean, people find
It's
different ways.
usually like in liquid form, like alcohol. Like the all of my nosos are in like an alcohol type of
Sure,
tincture.
for preservation, that makes sense. So, however,
They kick your butt though, man.
well,
They're
right.
legit. You take like one drop of that and you're laid out. Like
So
it does trigger an immune response. It does
But
work.
right, but yeah,
It's
and
rough.
but the thing about these people is they can't have an immune response. That's correct because their immune response was just putting spike proteins that's shedding that blood-brain barrier, so the propaganda sticks. Or people talk about if graphene, 5G, all these technologies. Look, I don't know. I watch the things. I'm curious. I don't trust them. We'll see. Let's see. Spooked Vids writes, I saw a video of farmland in the U.S. has not been planted this year. A bit strange. Not at all, dude. Here's the thing. Number one, cost of feed is way up, 50 to 100%. Fertilizer, Russia was providing a ton of the fertilizer. What they did was they converted that extra natural gas to fertilizer. Now we don't have that, so the cost of fertilizer is up 30 to 40%. The cost of trucking it is up, whatever the percentage is for that. We've had drought conditions throughout the entire West. We have a labor shortage like crazy because inflation is making the payment levels that were usually out there. That's why no one's going to work. I mean, if you were making, put it this way, if you're making $12 last year and $12 a year before that and $12 before that, or even if you went 12, 12.25, 12.50, when you're seeing the actual day-to-day inflation on things like food and energy, which is to say, through fuel, go up as much as 5 to 10% a month. And I know people say that's what they say the annual number. It's not the annual number. It's monthly. And I know that they're saying it's the annual number, but I'm watching the actual prices, and this is going to be one of the big problems. So you're absolutely right. And the other thing is, and I've heard this from multiple sources, I've seen in the UK and throughout the US, people are being paid to not grow. Their NGOs are buying land, putting it out of reach. Big venture funds are putting it out of thing. We are being set up in a situation where there will not be enough food. This is a managed die off. I don't know how anyone else can think of it that way. And this was a problem. If we go back, let's go back 10 years. A lot of people were writing about that time, Agenda 2020, and they were talking about forced automation. And the automation was going to cost somewhere between 20 to 40% of the jobs in the market, including some white collar jobs. And people were going to revolt and riot against it. Then came along COVID, and we got used to things being automated and working from home. And some people are going to disappear, and some jobs are going to disappear. Like, oh, we can't help it. It's a natural organic growth of the artificially released disease that the U.S. and China worked on. Okay, all of these things ended up happening. Yeah, the food plants being destroyed is also creepy. More of them all the time, and not just in the West. It's happening in Russia too. So both sides of that, a lot of mineral extraction plants are having problems over there. All of these things are set up in a way where the people who should be held to account are now not being, because we're fighting each other over the medical interventions. We're fighting each other over the existing social issues. We're fighting each other over ideologies, both within our countries and across our countries. And then we're going to be fighting for the day-to-day survival version of this. And at all point, no one is being held accountable, and we don't know in America especially, but I think throughout America, throughout Europe, everywhere. And I had this conversation the other day. You're not fighting the Democrats. You're not fighting the Republicans. You're not really even fighting Washington. What you're fighting is an oligarchy that uses money in certain ways as a leverage tool to have control and finance. And that if you want to change how that works, you have to change your behaviors. And unless we change our behaviors in a marked way, where we say, okay, we're going to remove all these people from power and we're going to have some new method of distribution where we constrain money so it can't be usurious, unending financial interest. I mean, that's what you have to do. I mean, and I'll give you examples. The Germans during the part of the German economic miracle before the war was they said you can't lend money for financial interest. It has to go into productive capacity. It's a sort of proto Keynesian approach, but it actually worked in a lot of different ways because the money had to go to productive capacity. But we don't do that in this world. And because we don't do that, it doesn't work out. Instead, we chase all these fiats and all these other things. So what ends up happening? It gets worse all the time, and we have all these different threats. And I'm not here to tell you which threat you need to be afraid of. You need to be afraid of them all. And the thing that's going to make it harder is we're going to be dealing with the boy crying wolf throughout the whole time. They're going to say, "Oh, this is going to be terrible," and then it won't be. And this will be terrible, and it won't be. And the moment that you get off your toes and you're like, "Oh, this is going to be terrible," like, "Oh yeah, you fool me again," you're going to be sitting in a hospital bed dying of something because you'll be like, "You didn't take it serious." I took COVID serious when it came out. You guys all know that. And I had a lot of people give me a lot of crap, and a lot of people still say this day, well, you should have known from the beginning. I didn't know, and that's the point. You can't know. You have to follow the evidence. But the problem is the evidence is made up, especially on the internet. Lord knows, how do you believe anything? Which is why I stress so strongly to you that separation and segregation from the world is something you need to seek. Get spiritually right with the Lord. Absolutely do that. Find people who think like you do and get away from the things that are threatening to you and give yourself the highest level of self sufficiency that you and those you can trust can find in the quickest interval you can manage. I genuinely believe, and I'm not putting an exact date on this, but I genuinely believe this will be the last summer you have the option of setting up that way. I will also add one thing to this that I would strongly suggest if you are in the Western United States. I've been reading the predictions for the weather patterns for the years ahead with what's going to happen with this drought. It's going to be bad for
Bad.
a decade. You need to get to where there's some water. I mean, if you're determined to stay out there, okay, you better be heading up for the mountains and for the hills and the waters. But, when they get real bad fires in the West, you could see the whole. And I'm not saying they may not help this. If you watch some of those California wildfires a couple years back, you know what I'm talking about. Dutch has had some amazing laser footage of some of that stuff. You could see
It looked
directed
like
energy
hell on
weapons.
earth, dude.
It will. And the funny thing is, you had fires burning underground that wouldn't go above. It was the craziest thing. I mean, I have to go find the videos of it, but the West is
And
going to
all
be up in
those weird
flames.
lasers that,
Yeah.
like, oh man, the
You could see, yeah,
DWs
you
and
could see all the stuff. It was crazy. So, I mean, I would strongly suggest that if you are out west, you take a thought of going to Appalachia or to the Great Lakes regions. And yeah, there's problems there. There's problems anywhere. I know a lot of people are heading down south. And I tell you what, if the system really doesn't like, let's say every God fearing Republican goes down south and lives in Florida because Mark DeSantis is the second coming of solution. All it takes is one tidal wave to wipe out that whole movement. And you think they wouldn't do things like that? I mean, have you been paying attention to the last 20 years? People say, oh, what? That would never happen. Just because you can't accept something as possible does not mean that it doesn't
heat's
happen.
really bad there in
Yeah,
parts of the south where they do a lot of farming.
sure,
Like they're running out of water in the west and they're getting baked in the south.
sure.
So
I
I don't
mean,
I don't know what's going to happen in the Midwest, Mid Atlantic, or up this way.
well, the
But
Mid Atlantic's not looking very good. We're so far north that we're in a different weather pattern. We're basically in Canada's pattern. But I mean, and people always ask me, why are you in Maine when it has such a purple state and it has? And I'm like, I'm behind enemy lines. I'm sitting here quiet. I'm in the woods. I'm not bothering anybody. I'm just sitting here on a log. I'm a lump on a log. Old Tubby Lumpus here, sitting by himself, just watching the world go by because I'm not trying to get into the fight. If I was, I'd be approaching this whole thing very differently. But that's what I would suggest to you. Be very thoughtful about where you go. I'm a big fan of Appalachia. If you need to be in a place where you think certain ways, southern, northern, whatever, I think anywhere from Georgia north in Appalachia is a beautiful place. Just
just
make sure you're
watch
not
out
too
for
near to
all
the
the
nuclear plants.
Bigfoots and down in them
The West
hollows.
Virginia monster, the Grafton County monster, was looking for Dana.
There's
Believe me, we
things down in
we,
them
we, we we
hollows,
went up
man.
hiking once. I remember back when we lived in Pennsylvania, man. You took that whole hike and then you hurt your ankle like on the very last bit of it. It was terrible.
I
It
did.
was,
That was the first hike I had taken in years. And at the
uh,
very end, I twisted my ankle.
Yeah, we got lost. I'm
It was really
faithful
bad.
pathfinder. I am not. I know where I am on the roads, but you take me off the road, I get a little squirrely.
It's a good
So
thing we had our cell phones
gotten
with
better
us, so we
now.
would have
Yeah,
just had to just Sleep in the
And
woods.
by the way, pro tip: it's something you can do that's really smart and really easy, and it's still really cheap. GPS. If we ever have a big war, will be taken out. If you don't know your back roads, get a gazetteer, an atlas, one of those red ones that shows
What's a
all the roads in your
gazetteer?
state. Huh?
What's a gazetteer?
It's those. Here, talk to the audience for a second.
I don't wanna.
Do it anyway. I'll be back. I'll show.
Um, I'm sorry, guys. I just don't feel too good.
Okay.
I don't have a whole lot to say.
Well, that's not helpful.
I thought you said that's a whole.
Okay.
Okay.
So they're like this. Delorme makes some. There's big ones for Canada too. If you are in a given place, why do you want a atlas like this? Let's just pick a place at random. Let's look at Greenville, where I used to live, just as a simple example. This page 41, and I'm going to show you why you want to have this. Because the day may come you don't want to take the main roads, and you have to do things, or you have to walk things. You have to get to places. So you have to get to water. So you get a thing like this, and it shows you every little dink road. It shows you every little logging road, mine road. It's like, I know because I lived there for years, which roads are actual roads and which aren't. Like some of these roads you couldn't even pass, but if you had to do that, or if you have to get out, especially if you live in a city, a suburban area, you have people coming to you, have a route, have a plan, have the ability to give yourself a different way around. And for the love of God, don't count on your phone being able to help you. If you have it, great. I mean, if you have a GPS system, you have a sat phone, a lot of people talk about that, fine. I like having things in paper. I'm old-fashioned.
Sat phones are like 6 months behind in production.
And I'll tell you this, it's no secret, because I did this just knowing. If I could drive anywhere from Nova Scotia to West Virginia on all back roads and have maps to lead me every step of the way. And that level of security, I think, cost me through thrift books maybe $40-50. And that was it. And you probably don't need that level. I just have it because if we have family members, whatever, different things. And these are things you have to think about. But definitely have physical maps of anywhere you're going to need to travel. Another thing you might want to have, if there are trails, rail trails, snowmobile trails, ATV trails, whatever they are, it means to egress and ingress different areas. Waterways, canals. Yeah, absolutely. It may be your best strategy. I'm not even kidding. It could be floaties, in a canal. Just make sure that you don't drink the water. But whatever it is, railroad maps and waterway, like Ryan said, perfect. Yeah, these are the sort of things you might want to have that are sort of advanced prepping. I mean, you think of your own life like a military campaign a little bit if it comes to this. So those are things that you can do. And look, it's entertaining. Take a back road, drive a back road, figure out which ones are passable. And if you need that for security levels, you can think about that too. I remember a joke I heard when I was living in Greenville. I don't know how true it was, but they said the first time things got bad enough, the boys of the logging plant were going to make sure that Greenville was closed lake. And all you got to do is put a couple, of those big timbers across the highway, and there ain't anyone getting through. You'd be lucky if you could climb over them. You need what's his name, Kristoff, to help you there from Frozen. Just throw the thing over. It would be like that. And these are things that we have to think about now.
Ice was Kristoff's thing, not wood.
Well, whatever. He didn't have to climb a mountain in one of them. Like Anna was trying to climb a mountain.
But you're talking about trees. What's that have to do with mountains?
Well, there's no one who climbs trees, so I had to use. Could be winter.
Paul Bunyan climbs trees.
No, Paul Bunyan knocks down trees. He didn't climb trees.
Paul
Bunyan's in Rumford breathing the toxins. Remember they got that big statue of Paul Bunyan.
I loved that cartoon when I was a kid.
Yeah, it was a good cartoon. But all right, so what am I saying? Things are going to get harder from here. There will be dead cat bounces where you have moments where you think things are going to get better, but they won't. Learn how to use resources on your area. And I will say, if you are someone who is impoverished, don't be afraid to use what resources the government provides when they don't have strings attached, because it's going to get to the point where a whole bunch more people are going to have to be in that spot, and being known as being in that position provides a degree of security. You have to play that very canny and what you're willing to give versus what you have. But most people are not going to be able, ready, or have the resources to get completely out. If you do, you should be doing it now, because the level of unpredictability, I mean, all of these things, all you need is one bad black swan. And it's like the other day I had to go down into the chicken coop, and I grabbed the one chicken, and she didn't like how I grabbed her. So she's going, and then every other person's like, and it's going to be a bit like that when things are going to go. One problem, one mistake leads to another mistake. Franz Ferdinand's just waiting to be assassinated.
You made all the chickens mad?
Yeah, I made. Well, that happens. Well, the one day I had to give Eddie the what for. So,
I gave him the what for
he deserved a
yesterday.
what for. He's a prick.
He
I mean,
attacked
he's
me, so
terrible.
I chased him and pinned him to the
He's
ground.
such a cock. He's a rooster, a cockerel. I like that word
He's a
better.
jerk. If he attacks me again, I'm gonna cook him.
So there you go. Don't run afoul of the missus. She ain't putting up with farm life rules.
It hurts.
It does hurt. No, it does hurt. You got to be a little canny. You fight him. I have a snow shovel I keep around for just that
I mean,
purpose. But
it hurts, and he is not a little rooster, and I am a small woman, and
all right,
he's
I'm
a.
gonna go ahead. I'm just going through what you guys wrote. Let's see. You wouldn't be surprised if there's a bunch of weapons. I agree. Yeah, I mean we don't know how it's all going to work at. The thing about Spooked Viz was talking about Desert Storm tank battles. The reason that worked is because the Iraqis had no air defense. And air supremacy is going to be the real determinant if there's a Russia America war. If it doesn't go to nuclear. I'd love to compare birth rates from 2018 to say 2025. You see, Musk was out there talking about that, how Japan's screwed because of their birth rate. I had an idea about global warming. Build a window blind system in space to create shade to cool us. Yeah, I mean, you could do a lot of things in space. I mean, absolutely, you could do that if that's what's necessary. You do solar sails. There's a lot of things. I mean, there's just different ways to go about it. I'm in NorCal, and the good old boys already know which bridges and roads to block to keep the Flatlanders out. Hey, I understand that, and let me tell you something. There's usually the guys who are going to take care of this thing are the blue collar guys who work at whatever industrial thing. Maybe it's a factory, maybe it's a log. If you're up here, it's loggers. When I lived down in Pittsburgh, it would have been the guys at the steel mill, whoever it is. Maybe it's loggers in Northern California, whatever you guys have. I'm sure there's something. And swim rights repent. Jesus is coming. I mean, amen, and not a moment too soon, right?
Amen.
I'm all with that. Definitely. So those are the things that I've been watching. Beyond that, what have I been doing? I've been going back and forth between reading stuff about Atlantis and Lemuria, which I saw this fascinating video that was from the Nautilus Project, which is a submarine program off the coast of Hawaii, and they're mapping that floor there. Honestly, it looks like the yellow brick roads under the sea, 4,000 feet underneath. It's crazy, and they're like, oh well, this is a natural thing. Yeah, that's a road. I know what nature looks like. That ain't it. But our history's been stolen from us, and trying to reclaim that's a big part of it. So I've definitely been reading about that and the mythologies of different countries. I mean, it's even amazing the Tolkien's myth of Numenor, how much he really connected it to Atlantis, and Tolkien knew some things between Tolkien and what's his name, Lewis. When you read some of the stuff, like if you read the Paralandra, the space trilogy, and how they connected. They literally weaved in the first man on Venus, and that they had Merlin pop up from a different time, from like a second age, and they were borrowing liberally from one another. It's pretty interesting, and I do think they knew things in history. A lot of things have been stolen from us. So that is Doggerland. Perfect. These are things that are really fascinating. And besides that, I've been reading a lot of Puritan stuff. I got a book. Was it coming from John Owen on the Mortification of Sin, which may not be so interesting to all you, but really, I find that the world increasingly is a distraction that is ever trying to change me from being the person I want to be. And that I would encourage each of you to consider that as the world gets crazier and crazier, does it not also seem like it gets more shallow, like the farce is coming forward? It's honestly like when you get to the end of the mission in a video game and there's a whole bunch of NPCs running around and things don't make sense anymore. And you almost start to see that like the world has become thin. Some people say the veil has become thin. And I think it's because the distractions of what was holding people in place are going away, because we are coming into a time of transformation. And, prayerfully, I hope it is the Lord coming back. We are there's certainly the biblical omens that would suggest that. But what I would also say to you is, as you go through your day to day life, what you should try to do is work to make yourself into the person you want to be and change your life to fit that, rather than always having to compromise who you are. Because I think we compromise ourselves so long. And the funny thing is, people say that's a bad thing when you do it for vices, but when you do it for virtues, like I remember in the 90s and the aughts, they were like, play hard, he who dies with the most toys wins. No, you still die, and you're just a jerk. Look, I enjoy experience. I enjoy, getting to do fun things. But if you sell who you are, what do you have left? I mean, you make yourself into a prostitute, and you don't want to be a prostitute, you know. Even you know what are you joining for the benefits, you know, for the health care package? Don't do that. Try to instead walk away from some of these things. And if you walk away and you keep walking away, I'm not going to say it's easy. It's not easy, but I think it's a better path. So that's a thought, and that's certainly what I've been working on. But you know, the Puritans for a second, because that's my own personal fixation. You know, I do think that young men, especially, because I look at the incel thing. It's funny because it was on 4chan, and like you watch all these people on Twitter, all these young women say, "We're not going to sleep with men if we don't have abortions on demand," and I'm like, "You already weren't." I mean, you know, I'm just like it's like these empty threats. They're so hilarious to me, and I'm watching them. I'm like, did you even know MGTOW was a thing?
I found that lady that said that on Twitter.
Did you? Oh yeah, that's right.
I found
You
it,
went after her
and
with
I
biblical
said I
wisdom.
did.
It was
I
funny.
was
No,
trolling. I was like, yeah, that's because
she
all the
did.
sane men have already married all the
I know
sane
nothing, and
women.
nothing made her madder than seeing pictures of happy families. You know, I hate to say it, but cats aren't the only family member you're supposed to have. But
It's just she was like pointing out areas where it's going to hit the hardest, and it's like where honestly there's the most fatherless homes, and I'm like, make fatherhood great again, you know, and just
I'll get back to Musk in a second because I do think that's interesting. Yeah, no, yeah, watching Dana go at that was actually quite hilarious. But the thing I was
I
thinking
was just
about,
bored that day.
well, that's fine. But the thing I was thinking was, you know, people make fun of the Puritans because they say, oh, they went too far, and maybe they did. But they were trying to create a society where they were led not into temptation. And when you look at what images do to us, how we've been hijacked by the optic nerve, and how we don't even think. Like I look at Twitter, okay, and I look at my YouTube feed. You know what my biggest video was this month? It was a 15-second apology for the fact that my feed cut out. That got 2,200 views. That wasn't even saying anything, but the algorithm picked it up. My second biggest video was me showing a minute of my chickens in my yard that had over 900 views. And every other video that was longer had only 200 views. When I do a video like this, I'm lucky if I get 300 views. And look, I'm going to keep doing it. But we are constantly being herded into having no attention span. We are being held captive by our chemistry. It's something you really need to be aware of, and that you really need to change your habits to not get caught up in that. For instance, like long form reading. I would give this challenge to everybody that you need to pull yourself out to the point where you can do that, and you can take the time and to appreciate stillness, to have some ability of memorization. Multitasking is a great thing to have, but if you're multitasking all the time so much, you're not giving yourself time for thought. Your constant stimulus response. Don't get John Boyded. You want your OODA loop to be something you decide, not something that's forced it upon you. And whether that's because of money, whether that's because of stimulus, whatever it is, don't let that happen. Richard writes, C.S. Lewis and Tolkien are two great Christian authors. Tolkien has the edge, though Catholic, of course. Well, we'll leave that aside. You know, Lord knows I'm. You know, it was, I actually had. I mean, I'll go there for a second since you brought it up. One of the things I was talking about Catholic, because I grew up Catholic actually, and one of the things that was interesting to me is I was talking about mortification of sin, and I think the Catholic view, and you can correct me if you're wrong, because I know people may not agree, but this was my experience of Catholicism, is that the goal was to suffer and to sublimate the sin where you were sublimate the desire that was wrong. So Catholic view of the world, in my experience of it, is you go through the world suffering and seeking absolution. And that's probably why purgatory makes sense in the Catholic theology, because you're constantly trying to not be yourself, because you know you're at war with your nature, because the sin is fallen. And theologically, that's correct. But I think at its best times, what happened, the Protestant approach was somewhat different, that what you would try to do instead of thinking of yourself as suffering is to try to see yourself as invigorated in life in the spirit of Christ, where instead you would be beyond that. And I will tell you, as someone who was once Catholic, I've never really gone past the suffering, miserable Christian thing. I mean, it's probably why my ministry has such a hard edge to it.
Yeah.
But and I think a lot of
I
people
was
don't. But the
briefly
theory
Catholic.
of it, yeah, I mean, we
I
came
was
at it. I'm
briefly
Polish.
Catholic
You know, yeah, absolutely. My wife has,
for like a year, and then that was it.
well, and that was and look, this isn't about taking shots, but I think in some ways the Orthodox have the right of it though, in that in order to defeat sin, if you try to defeat sin, you're dooming yourself to failure. So trying to stop the desires is always a problem. And not that you shouldn't do it, but the goal, I think, is to not feel those desires. So you're born in a new spirit. And I know in the Orthodox tradition, the liturgy is all about the repetition of the behavior so you get the mind of Christ. Like the sinner's prayer, Lord Jesus, have mercy on me. And you say it about 10,000 times until you can't think of anything else without being so destructive that at some point you have that flip where, like, you go from saying, instead, I want to believe in something, you actually believe in it. So instead of saying, I want to be like Jesus, but I'm not, I'm a sinner and I'm a son of a bitch, then instead you start acting like that sort of person. But I think that the institutional religious basis of a lot of mainline Protestantism, too, to be very fair, like your Anglicans, your Episcopalians, people like that, Lutherans is caught up in that. And of course, there's a lot of problems in even evangelism, right? Like most of the people there go and they basically promise you your happy world and feel good Jesus. And it's disgusting. And I mean, I'm enough of a Calvinist where it doesn't really bother me for the idea, that there is an elect that comes forward, because I've managed to kind of work out in my mind enough where I can accept free will, that you have these choices, but hey, God's going to know because time's illusory. That's a, who knows? If you ever want to come up here and have a deep conversation with theology, come on up to Northern Aroostook County, bring a nice bottle of red wine and a willingness to talk for a couple hours. This has literally happened with some people on this channel, where it does occasionally happen that way. And hey, if it does,
Bring me
welcome.
some cheese.
And bring Dana some cheese. If you
I
come from
can't have
Can,
one.
no,
I
yeah,
can't
Dana
drink.
Dana can't drink, so it's just bad for her. But let's see what y'all are writing real fast here. We'll go back here. All right, so I want to talk about it was wiped out by water. Atlantis is off the coast of Britain. That's Atlantis had 10 constituent kingdoms. That's what Plato wrote, and I actually believe that. I do believe they include, but are not limited to, I believe the Mayans were part of it, the
You mean there was more
Proto-Mayans.
than one?
Yeah, there were 10. There was the Toltecs. I mean, these were the people, the different groups of people where they were located. The Toltecs, which lately have become the Aztecs and the Bloody, and I think they kind of got the worst of people. I think that's where the Quetzalcoatl thing came in from. There were the people the Cusco people who eventually become the Incans. I guess that's the Nazca, the Nazca lines. There's going to be the Berbers, the Basques, the Celts. Who else do I think is there? I think the Scythians were one too.
Yeah,
I would
I'm
not be
Scythian.
surprised if the Sumerians were one,
I'm
and
Scythian.
whatever you think the Aryans, because people thought the
I'm
traditional way it's
Scythian.
told. Yeah, I know you are.
I'm
The
Scythian.
the way it's traditionally told is that people spread from the Caucasus and they went east to west because of the Indo-European languages. But if you look at the roots, the better argument is actually they went west to east first, and then they kind of went backwards, and that kind of fits into the flood story, Ararat, the Lesser Dryas flood, all those things. And there's a whole bunch to it. I mean, I'm trying to understand the background of this. It's the most fascinating story of how humanity fell from, like in Hesiod wrote in was it Theogony? There was the age of the golden man where we were connected to God, where we were still, think of it like being in the garden. And it's hard to connect these things between mythology as it's told and precisely right, Dipper, west to east and then back west. Except for the people who lived in, Central America and whatnot, and they went a different direction, but that's fine. Um, so anyway, the golden age, what you could think of as being in Eden, then there was the silver age, which would be, man before the flood, and then there's the bronze age, which we understand as antiquity, and now there's here the iron age, where we're about to collapse into graphene, and we're here at the end of the time, thinking that, we have all this technology, but we know ourselves, I would argue, less than any time in history. And so history has been a decline and a fall from grace, but eventually I think it will be connected back forward. And you can see the different bits and pieces of this if you're willing to be a little flexible, maybe a little gap creationism to make it all work, so that the timelines work out. Because there's so many lies, and trying to cut through them all is actually beyond this. But yeah, the coming out of Africa thing, that's a load of crap. I mean, it's sort of interesting if you really, really get into the research about it. It seems like there were connections between what we call, I'm not saying this to be offensive because I know it's going to be taken this way, but the red, white, and yellow peoples seemed like they were doing their own thing in the Atlantean world. Okay, and they had a phrase for it. What's the word? Denisovians. They had a specific phrase they used to describe the Asians who were one of the first ones who came out of it, the East Asians, and then the people who were Aboriginal, who were the brown folk. By that I mean India, like Indians, like India, Pakistan, India. and the Polynesians and sub-Saharan Africans, maybe they were part of the Lemurian group, because it does seem at some point, and this is even borne out by the genetics. There's a degree of speciation in that, there's more of the Neanderthalis genes, whereas there's more of an Erectus gene if you go down south into Africa and these other areas. And so the version of life that happens in the southern hemisphere and the east is more experiential based. And that actually explains one of the weird contradictions, which is how you have red haired light folk as the Brahmins running India, while you have all these other people like you have in southern India. And the Victorians always talk about this thing, and they understood it, but then you weren't allowed to talk about race, because race talks about history, and all that got buried under the socialist ideology crap. And it's not about disrespect to any people. Look, whatever your tribe, whatever your nationality, there's no shame in what you're born. There's no shame being proud. God's here to redeem all of our children. And maybe we're not all meant to live exactly together. Some people choose to live together. That's great. Some people choose to live apart. That's great. I've always taken that position. I don't believe in the forced homogenization of people, of cultures, or ideas. Because ultimately, even as a Christian, I'll support that. I mean, I'd be happy to send everyone from exile from Pineland who has a terrible ideology or theology. But I mean, ultimately, you can't force people who think differently to live together. That multiculturalism is always a form of hell. But to the point, I don't think that those folks were in the same Atlantean story. Now, were they God's children? Sure, everyone is. But how that all worked out is different. And I see some, like, there's this one lady I hear us every now and then, because like I hear it, I like some of this, like, not that I want to get into it, but like Black Hebrew Israelite, theology. I'm like, the people who lived in West Africa at that time didn't even know where these places were on the map. So how are you going to justify it? The only black tribe that I'm aware of that was heavily involved with that part of the world were the Ethiopians. And Ethiopia's kept a very cultural, successful, literate culture. You could say Sheba, which is South Arabia. But basically, when you get to about the Kenya line, anything south of that was living in a totally different world. And maybe it's interesting because, they say the Eastern Rift Valley was slammed onto Africa later. Maybe the Somalis really did come from somewhere else, and that's why they're so different than the Ethiopians, and why those cultures, grate on one another. I mean, I don't know the answers to it, but I know we're not even allowed to ask the questions, and this is the problem of it. But I do think that it's an interesting question to ask, and I am very curious about it. And if you read how the people were thinking about it from basically about 1800 through 1950, you would see they actually were presenting much more effective evidence, because we've become fixated on scientific technology like carbon 14 dating. Everything's about carbon 14 dating and DNA markers. Well, I've learned with DNA markers, they use the same PCR testing that proved absolute crap during COVID. And carbon 14 dating depends upon having a constant magnetic field. As we are experiencing now, and we watch the North Pole move, we are having a variant magnetic field. So if we had a pole flip, let's say if we had a pole flip happen 10,000 years ago, which is not a crazy thing. Those of you who've read Hapgood or Chan Thomas or any of those things, these things are possible. And it actually explains better why some lands looked like they were under the ocean, they came up, they came below. All these sort of questions, then the whole magnetic thing would change the nature of how carbon behaves under those extreme environments. And what it would do is it would render that sort of dating beyond a very limited time frame absolutely useless. But they never talk about this because, hey, trust the science, right? And trust the people who are getting the big paychecks to tell you the lies. So you have to go and figure out your own history. And what I choose to do is I choose to work it out through culture, through myth, through sort of the logics of what people end up where. But you do end up with these light-skinned, light-eyed people everywhere. Although I will say that it is my own expectation that actually in Atlantis, it was probably people who were of what we would consider today Native Americans, whatever you call them, Indians, the red folk, were actually probably the predominant ones. And as much as I can tell the story from Plato, as you saw the people who were the natives of Attica, the Proto-Athenians, it probably was the rebelliousness of white folks rising against the sea people that were red folk back then that led to sort of this fight. And that might be a description of what happened in Atlantis, where Poseidon, supposedly the name of the capital of that, was actually an invasion that happened in the later period of Atlantis after some time after it had been started. And so you're looking at all these mythologies, like the Mayan book, the Popol Vuh, or the Vedas of India. And there's a story there, and if you can kind of separate out the BS paganism, and you're really looking, there's a time before Adamic man where things were maybe different, or, before Noah at least, that there are these different lines. And remember, even post Noah, this is going to be different because Noah, let's say Noah was pure in his generations, right? But the families were actually different in the sense that that every one of the wives would have been compromised, and so you had that. Plus, there were other survivors. So, and like so Ryan says, they were called red because they covered their white skin with red paint, not actual red race. I don't know. It's a little trickier, but you're right. They did that, and a lot of the people who were big on tattoos and big on skin painting were probably groups of this, like the Celts as an example. The people who
Moana.
were here, or well, Moana's different. The Polynesians, I'm pretty convinced, were Lemurians, and they were part of the culture that existed. They think there might have been a continent. I know what's his name. Spence Lewis is his name? Lewis Spence was saying that he thought, and he's like the guy who wrote the book on it. There was probably a continent that stretched from where modern Hawaii is down to New Zealand. That could have been. They would have called it Mu or Lemuria. And some people in the esoteric, like Steiner and others, write about this. Casey, that there was a different culture, or Steiner specifically says that the Lemurians were people who lived in almost like a dreamlike state, where they were in a closer form of consciousness, and they learned strictly through experience. So, but they would pass experience between generations, and they talk about in the occult as the Akashic records. That's Blavatsky and all that crap. But I really think it's more about the idea that you just have a cloud where you have the excess shared memory you can add. And genetic memory seems to be encoded because our brains are basically, if you look at DNA, it's just protein encoding. So what we're really doing is transmitting and transceiving, receiving and transmitting the information that comes into our minds. But we don't understand the first thing about ourselves, and that's kind of the point I'm trying to make to you. We don't understand the nature of our reality. That's why the quote was from Second Corinthians, "Learn to see by faith and not by sight," is so important here. And I just don't go into it more because it's fascinating to me, and it's fascinating to you, as evidenced by the fact you're staying on the channel. But it's the problem is, you can let that get in the line with good theology, and that's a problem too, because you have these mysteries where there are contradictions. And the thing is, we live in a miraculous world that has holes in it. So maybe that doesn't have these sort of things, and so these are things that I've been researching very deeply, and trying to gain a better understanding of. Well, I look at that folklore, and it's funny because I'll spend one day reading about Atlantis and their sort of crazy folk religion, and then the next day I'll be sitting there in sort of penance reading my Puritan thing, thinking, oh, I don't want to lead people astray because time is so short, and a society, and this is one thing, actually, it's a question I'll throw to you. What things do we know that we would be better served to not know? Like, I'll give you an example I've thrown out before, but I hold to it, and maybe it has relevance to the show. I think you would learn more if you didn't see my face. If you were just listening to me talking and having to consider the ideas, but not be distracted by if I have a piece of food here, or if I spit a little bit here, or if I look at Dana. But people like having that full immersion, and that full immersion might not be good for us because we need to go ahead and let our brain do a little bit of the running instead of having everything just be straight absorption. But you're fighting against the trend of what we all follow, and finding all the little ways in which that happens was what those societies were. They were societies of restraint and discipline that were designed to make better people, whereas we build a quote unquote better world so that we can be lesser people. And in this devolution that we keep assisting in through technology and the systems logic of the construct, where in fact we've gotten to the point where we're going to give part of our mind over. We'll go to Elon Musk because Ben asked about that. I can't see him as the good guy because of his chips. He said a really interesting thing in response to a comment the other day, and I don't know if he actually said this because I don't go check his Twitter feed every day. I'm just not that guy. But he was saying there was some guy, Muhammad something, who was talking to him about faith. He's like, odds are I'm going to hell because most people are there, but all the interesting people will be there anyway. Now, I don't know if he actually said that, but if he actually said that, that's pretty sad to me. And it might fit his sort of libertarian humanism, whatever it is, whether you think he's a robot, whether you think he's a demon, whether you think he's a grifter, whether you just think he's crazy, or whether you think he's a hero. He certainly seems to walk to the beat of his own drummer, and it is a compelling story that is almost heroic, right? Because he's standing against the system, but his vision of the future might just be more personal in terms of its tyranny, in terms of what he's doing. But I heard an interesting thing. I think I shared this the other day, but and it bears repeating, is that a lot of why he's looking at buying Twitter is to try to get more subsidy for SpaceX, as a means of controlling public consent. And if you think about how Tesla was built basically on public subsidy, it's not a bad argument about how it should be put together. So I don't know. We'll see how that all works out. But I do think that at least he would open up Twitter a little bit, and I think that's a good and helpful habit. And I do know that Starlink has apparently played a pretty big role in Ukraine, and that I think that has played a role in him getting into the good graces of government with its big money. So, but yeah, I do think that he is. Ultimately, I agree with you, Ryan, that I do think he is a con, and it's an operation just like with Trump, and that he has been groomed his whole life. I mean, I don't know his backstory well enough to say all that, but I can smell it. I can smell a lie from pretty far away. I mean, I spent years in politics. It takes one to know one. I used to have a buddy who said game recognizes game, and it's really the truth of it. You can kind of see. And looking to him for the answers is a dangerous thing because he's leading you further on the road to technology. I mean, and I think that's a bad road for us. And I know people struggle to get out of it. I do too. I mean, I share that addiction with all you guys. So it is a problem. So let's see what else you were writing about. But I'm glad to what Ben was saying. I mean, I really like some of the things he says, but I don't think he's ready to take a jump. And who knows? Look, I pray for everyone to repent. I pray for everyone to come to God. I mean, there are heathens over here. I know some of you, and it's like I know I'm never going to reach you, but I'm going to keep trying because you know what? I still care. I want you to make it. I want everyone here to make it, even my enemies. And there are days, there are people where I'm just like, you know what? The Lord's judgment's going to come upon them, and I have to tell myself, don't take joy in the fact people are going to suffer. Because once you go down that road, it's not long before you start chasing your own virtue and you try to destroy everything to remake the world in the image of what you think should be right. And we all do that a little bit, and we can't help it. And I wouldn't say it's always the worst instinct either, because giving up altogether isn't the answer. You just pray that what you're doing is pleasing to God, and you put God at the center of what you're doing. It's the only way you can manage to screw up less, or at least you can live with yourself, hopefully. But that's why I try to balance my sort of interesting diversions into the world that's hard to understand with biblical truth, because I trust Jesus. I mean, you have to have faith in something, and I have faith in the Lord as the Savior. So, and I think that a lot of people have come to realize after the limits of every system, every philosophy, at some point it's just about faith. And you know what? Christianity served us pretty well, our folk, I think. But that's my opinion. You may or may not share it. I hope you do. All right. Let's see what else y'all are writing. Give me 1 second here. I went back too far. I'm just reading your comments. So if you don't see me doing things, it's because I'm trying to catch up. The days do feel short. Absolutely. Nicholas, good to see you, by the way. I know you wrote me a question back where, but I missed it. I'm trying to find it, but my eyes are a little fuzzy at this point in the day. So I apologize if I miss it. I will look and see if I can find it. Or if you want. What did you miss? You missed everything. I gave the secret to life. No, it's just fine. Let's see. Great analysis. One of the fellows I work with always makes jokes about Catholics and being on their knees all the time. Look, I actually like Catholics, but your Pope is terrible, man. Depose him. You know what? I will. I'll tell you what. I'll make you a deal. I will stop making jokes about Catholics when you get rid of that apostate. And you all know that by your own doctrine. And look, you should read the Bible, not the Catechism. But in any case, get rid of him. He's bad. And I say that. And look, I tell you how I hate. I haven't told you a Protestant preacher I liked. So put that in that way. All right, random New Zealand news. Earlier this year, we put in law safe spaces around abortion clinics. Maybe what's happening in the U.S. is coming here. Random thought. Well, New Zealand has gotten screwed. Remember the whole thing with Christchurch, how they took your guns away? Yeah, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I mean, but I have read one of the reasons, and take it for what it's worth, but there are a lot of people who think that the reason that they're getting rid of abortion so quickly is they're not going to have the population. A lot of people talking Musk again, talking about this problem. People aren't having kids. And at some point, even if they want to have a slave race, I don't think they're ready to go full automation just because it's so chic to have a human do the work instead of a machine. Shows that you really are high class, right? I don't know. I mean, it's certainly something to take a look at. Thank you, Corey, for sharing my book. Appreciate that. And I hope you check it out. By the way, before we continue, let me just do the channel announcement. Surviving the Fall of America is available right now. It's over on Amazon, so go get it while you can before the economy collapses. The paperback, we have it in Kindle. The other books are all up there if you want to support the program. Super Chats, Venmo, CVC, PRV, PO Box 343, Eagle Lake, Maine 04739, and your prayers. I know a lot of people don't have a lot of ability, and do what you can. And if it's look, if there's someone who needs it more and you really got to take care of it, pray to the Lord, ask Him to lead you. We are fortunate that we have a wonderful community that supports us, and we just ask that you pay for it. And you'd be surprised how much we actually invest into other people. And it's not about bragging. It's about when you see the need, not looking the other way. That's what Christ taught. When I was hungry, did you feed me? And even I was telling Dana this morning, that I've gotten to the point in my life where I'm more willing to get tricked into supporting something I shouldn't if it's for a good cause, than overlooking someone I could have helped. And I think if we had that mentality a little bit more, I don't want to call it naivety. It's more about, you know, we have to change how we look at one another. Good to see you, David. Glad you are here. Thank God it's Monday. Absolutely. You can see evidence that continent there was deep earthquakes near Tonga. I have seen that. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. We pray for redemption. Absolutely. Anything they insist on putting in our face must be BS. Yeah. Look up the interview Musk did with B a couple of, I don't know. Like I said, it's an interesting thing. It's a curious thing. I mean, he's definitely someone to keep an eye on. And we'll see. Maybe I do feel like we are being set up for a narrative flip where we're going to see, the good guys become the bad guys and the bad guys become the good guys. And I think if they want to have an actual fight and they want to have high agency people, they're going to have to purge the wokeism. And maybe having this all fall apart and keeping Biden in there and being the fall guy and having all this removed, because, I mean, let's be honest. If I'm right about what I've been saying about the injections for a lot of years, the people who are going to be most heavily impacted and falling away are not going to be people like us, by and large. It's going to be city dwellers who think a certain way and who have trusted the system. And the interesting thing I saw the CDC reported was they were saying the one day, and I may script the exact numbers, but they were saying something in the neighborhood of 80 million people didn't even take one. And 160 million people, or 167 million more didn't take the second one or the third one. And it seems like the worst impacts actually came with the multiple doses. So I think if that's true, a lot more people are going to come through this unscathed. And the sort of people who are not going to come through it are going to be the exact sort of people who have made existence miserable for the rest of us. So maybe there is some hope in that, in the one sense of at least not having to deal with that irritant. I don't think this world has any hope for it in terms of what we're experiencing day to day. That's why I come and do my sermons on Sundays, and then deal with demons messing with me the rest of the day. Look, if I seem like a crazy person, it's just because I spend a lot of time experiencing the world and being open to the thoughts and the experiences that are happening around me. And I would encourage that for everyone. So let's see what else we have here. You guys will get rid of them, but jokes and banter must never stop. Hey, you know what? I'm always praying for people to come around and to have a success in that. And like I said, I mean, the only thing I would say to anyone who proclaims to be a Christian, don't ever let what anyone teaches you of any denomination contradict the words of Christ. And if you don't like every little bit of the Bible that's put in there, that's fine. Compare it to the Gospels and check how it all works out. For my Catholic friends, I always say, it says, call no one Father except your Father in heaven. So if you adopt a new name, that'd be a plus too. And maybe, hey, maybe there'll be a reform because honestly, churches do change over time. If it was me and you purged the Jesuits, I'd be happier. I'd be happy if we got rid of all the Freemasons running around. I think it's terrible. And, there are different groups and all these different things. But this is what we deal with. The thing is, when people try to do good in whatever pathway it is, the devil throws different things up when people are trying to bring people closer to God. And that's something you always struggle with. And you see that more in Christianity than anywhere else because that's the true faith. And I genuinely believe that. I mean, it's always funny when I was in dissident politics, there were always these pagans running around in identity politics, and they'd always be like, "Don't you need to worship the race?" And they always end up simping for some woman who promised witchcraft. It was actually so sad. It always happened that way. No, it always was. Remember when we were living in that world and how they were always apologizing. Well, she's representing the folk wisdom of our people. I mean, look, if you have to reduce God to elevate yourself, you're doing it wrong. Any God you can understand perfectly is not the God you should be following. And that's the mystery of the Father. And that's why monotheism always wins, because God should be beyond us. Because if we can imagine something greater than ourselves, God should be beyond our imagination. And yet we imagine him as being accessible, like as a Christian in the Trinity. You imagine him as Christ, literally man as God and God as man, where you can connect at that level, but you're not taking away from the essential nature of God as something that's unknowable. Whereas when you have all these pantheons and deities, basically men-made God, you are reducing God to make yourself feel better. And yeah, look, does it build cultures and does it build communities? Sure it does, because it elevates you, and myths can do that, folklore can do that. Go read the Campbell book, Hero with a Thousand Faces. But the point of it is that you're making God less than he could be, and that's the most banal, simple form of not only just blasphemy, but just bad logic. If you can imagine a God greater than your God, you're not supporting God, you're supporting a pretender, and whatever you call it, Zeus, Thor, the demiurge, whatever you call it, there's going to be something greater. There's going to have to be that one, that beginner. Some people use the word the source. I call it the Father. That's what it is, and that's what you have to start from. In the beginning, that's where he is. If he's, then there's nothing beyond that. That's beyond us. And people are not okay with mystery. But coming back to that, in search of that and in support of that and in love for one another and in support of that, that's the Christian walk. And that the rest of the world pummels you for it, because you are literally trying to become of a nature that is able to survive the end of this world. I mean, that's what it is about. That's what sin's about. Sin is death because it's separation from God, and the separation from God is that your spirit is caught up in what you want rather than what God wants. So if you're seeking what God wants and you dedicate yourself to that, Christ say he knew you, God will have a nature of that, and you get to go on to the next level. If not, it's like I scored 8 billion points, but you didn't accomplish the main objective, which was to have a nature that is acceptable to that which is true and eternal. And contemplating on that is honestly the one thing that everyone needs to spend more time on. So let's say a prayer. Get your last minute questions ready or ideas, anything you want to put out here. I think we put together a pretty good show, and it's about closing in on 9 p.m. So old man Winter here needs to go to sleep. But I've had a lot of fun hanging out with you guys. I love doing the evening shows. I just have so low energy, but I'm trying to recover. Last night was the first night in forever that I slept well, and praise the Lord for that. So, Heavenly Father, I just pray for the safety of everyone who supports this show and who's out there at large, for the health for those who are sick, for help for you who need it, whatever way, whatever you're suffering, that you be a balm, Lord, in their heart, and that they be able to use this invitation to come and invite you into their life for a fuller and more meaningful experience that will lead them through this world and that which follows. So in Jesus' mighty name, I pray that for everyone. Amen. Thank you for spending time with myself, with Dana this evening. We appreciate you all. Thank you for your prayers. Thank you for your ongoing support. If you get the book, by the way, please, 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 it makes a big difference. Leave a comment. And be honest, that's fine. If you want to give it 4 stars, 3 stars. If you want to give it 1 star, okay, take the night off. But if you have something to say, and I don't mind constructive criticism. Look, I will tell you something very fun about that book. I literally wrote that book, most of that book, while I was going through the fever dreams of COVID. So if it came out brilliant, awesome. If it came out crazy, not surprising. But I think there was an honesty and an openness. Sometimes you feel like you can see beyond the ether a little bit. I really feel like that came out in that book. And I was surprised that when it was done, I had 3 excellent peer readers go through it for me. And these are men of experience and character who they all loved it. And I was surprised because I went through it. I was like, oh man. Because I honestly like talking about Atlantis. I mean, I like my hobbies. If you hang out with me, I'll sit and talk about theology and archaeology all day and like history. I will, you have to drag me kicking and screaming to talk about current events. I'm like, why do we have to talk about collapsology? I don't want to talk about collapse, but that's what you need to know about. So I make myself a deal. Every other book I write, a book you guys like. Every other book I get to write a book I like. And yeah, I don't sell that much when I do that. But hey, you know what? Some of the best books are the ones that don't even get read. Like In God We Must is not a book a lot of people read. It's actually a really, really smart thing about how sin traps people. And people don't want to hear that because we don't want to change our nature. We just want to know how we can survive the next day ahead. And so, okay, I will try to offer you that. But I'm going to say if survival is your ultimate goal, then you need to start thinking beyond, the day when you go, when you have a tag on your toe and someone's sitting there crying over you, you want to have something beyond that. And that's going to depend on what kind of character you take on yourself. So you guys are all a good character. You're smart. You look at things. You don't get to this channel if you're not curious about the world. Have enough curiosity about yourself and open your heart a little bit. Allow yourself to feel again. And it's okay if you don't like other people. I don't either. But you have to find a way to have a little bit of a heart for people. And if you do, maybe you'll find you're in a better shape. So thank you again for all your support. I will be back. Be surprised if you get a show tomorrow. I have to do some stuff on the road. You might get a little 15-20 minute rant about how much thing. In fact, you probably will because I have to do shopping. That's the plan. I'll just say that. And so I'm going to look at prices and I'm going to throw a hissy fit. So if you'd like me to throw a hissy fit, I will do so, and I will offer some useful observations, like the one we shared the other day about how you don't see the large sizes anymore, and that's how they're hiding it. So I'm definitely going to be looking for things like that while I do my big shopping downstate. So we'll take care of that. And beyond that, I just want to say thank you again for spending your evening with me. God bless, and you guys have a wonderful evening. So for Dana, I'm Tom Pinelander.